and of the Holy Ghost. Amen. You may be seated. I was not a particularly good student, but I do remember some things from school. One of the things that I remember is the day that I learned about AM radio waves. I remember it because it captured my fascination. I was super interested in how these long, slow waves could go such long distances, while these short, frenetic, anxious waves, FM waves, would go so short distances. I had this image of this blue whale just kind of arcing all the way through the Midwest where I was raised to reach where I was. Unfortunately, the programming on AM radio is awful, as is FM usually. But nevertheless, I was fascinated by AM radio waves. I'd like to present that to you as an image for the homily today, because we're going to be talking about how God tells long stories that go long distances through time, and that these long stories are marked by a lack of frenetic anxiety. They are gentle, they are peaceful, and therefore they are long. The subject today is that God tells long stories. And we're going to be looking at our text today from Isaiah 51, and how Isaiah reminds the people in exile that they have a very, very long story. And that if they are going to be spared from anxiety, it's going to be because they remember the length of their story. This is a particularly needed topic for me because, as many of you know, I have struggled with anxiety for over 10 years. At times, it's been a very serious battle. I'm thankful to say, by God's grace and through counseling, I'm in a good space. But anxiety is something that I'm not alone in. I know that there are about a dozen of you that have talked to me about your struggles with anxiety. Statistically, anxiety is the #1 affliction of modern Americans. And so, even though our topic today is very much still focused on Isaiah 41, I'm going to be gearing a little bit more of the moral reading towards answering some things that create anxiety in the church. We're going to be going through the fourfold sense of the text. And I make note of that because we have been on a fourfold sense preaching series for a long time. And today is the last sermon in the series on Isaiah. We're going to be meeting as a clergy team soon to discuss how we're going to continue. But this is the last one in a very long series walking through the book of Isaiah. You might remember that before we were in Isaiah, we were in Genesis and then Exodus. I think we had a week or two in Numbers and Deuteronomy. We skipped Leviticus for some reason. I don't know. Maybe next year. Maybe we'll preach through the whole book of Leviticus next year. What do you think? But today is the last in the Isaiah series. And I think it's very appropriate because even though most of the weeks have been really focused on the typological vision of Isaiah. Isaiah was considered the greatest of the prophets. Some of the fathers considered him to be the fifth evangelist because he, more than anyone in the Old Testament, was able to peer down the corridor of time, and he was able to see the outline of the Messiah better than anyone else. He had foresight beyond any of the other prophets. And so we learn about what the ministry of Christ was to be and how that would map itself onto the church. But one of the themes that we haven't paid as much attention to is what Isaiah was speaking to the people who were in the midst of their exile. I think it would be easy for us to underestimate just how anxiety-producing an exile would be. These people would have been ripped from not only their geography, it was the place that God had promised to them. So it was their place of favor. They would have been ripped from their temple, which was, to say the least, a great comfort to them. because it showed that God was with them. So they were ripped from their geography, they were ripped from their homes, they were ripped from their status as God's people of blessing, they were ripped from the temple that they had labored to build. And then there's the internal exiles that go into an external exile. They were, all of them, ripped from the story of their own lives. They were just like you. They had an idea about how their lives should turn out. They had hopes for what they would do next year, in 10 years. They had hopes for their children. They had career paths. They had future spouses picked out, just like you all do. So this exile would have been extremely anxiety-producing. We don't do that justice very often. In spite of this, or in the context of this, many in Israel were losing the faith. And so in the later chapters of Isaiah, you have a very big emphasis on what theologians call a remnant theology. Say remnant theology. You have it a little bit in the early chapters of Isaiah, but it's especially present in the later chapters of Isaiah. And this is because as the world was getting a little bit more complicated, as the exile was really setting in and it was becoming real, people started to lose faith. They said, well, what's it for? What's this following Yahweh for? I don't think I am going to be a good Jew. I think I'm just going to be a Babylonian or an Assyrian or a nothing, a none, as we call them today. And so the message of Isaiah starts to become a little bit more focused on those, as it says in verse 1 of our passage, who seek righteousness, who pursue the Lord. He starts his message off in chapter 51. If you're not there, turn there, please. He starts off his message to them as those who pursue righteousness, those who seek the Lord. And that's because we're in the later chapters of Isaiah. The world around them is falling apart. Everyone's filled with anxiety. They've been ripped from everything that they thought would be their life story. And many are falling away from the church of Israel. Many are falling away from the faith. And so he's talking to a remnant, those who pursue righteousness. The message that he gives to the remnant is very appropriate for our times. He says to them, look to the rock from which you were hewn, and to the quarry from which you were dug. Look to Abraham, and to your father, and to Sarah who bore you, for he was but one when God called him. So he's taking their vision of their story that they're in, and he's making them stretch back, and then back further, back to where there was no hope in what man could do. It was only up to God. That's why he says, when Abraham was called, he was just one person. And God promised that he would be more than the sand of the sea. Do not be defined by the short story of the present moment. Be peaceful in the long story that God is telling. So, these people that are in exile, I want to take a step into their mind. If Isaiah were to tell them, look back to the rock from which you were hewn, what do you think are possible narratives, shorter narratives, than the one that he suggests in verse 3 or 4, in verse 2? So he goes back all the way to Abraham, and then in the next verse he goes further back into Eden. I want to show you, though, that if you think about the people in Israel, they might have been tempted to draw a shorter story. They might have said, okay, all right, go back. Maybe we'll go back to when the kingdoms split. You know, we're the tribe of Judah. Things really began. The story in which we really live is when we got rid of those pesky northern Israelites. When the church split. That's whenever the church really began. Do you think that they could have gone back to the time when the kingdom split? Would that have been too short a story? It would have been. They would have gone back possibly to the golden days of Solomon. Oh, and Solomon, if we could just start the story there. Or maybe one back further, the Davidic government. Maybe we'll start our story there. No. He says to go back further, tell a longer story. What about the conquests of Joshua back in the bloody days, back when we meant business? Nope. Go back further. What about the law of Moses when we were gathered around Sinai? That's when we were very near to God. No. Back further. Tell a longer story. He says, go to the rock, look to the rock from which you were hewn, and the quarry from which you were dug. And this long story would overpower the anxiety that they would not be enough for whatever came next. I'll say that again. Longer stories destroy the anxiety that we will not be enough for what comes next. That we would be too few in number, too weak, too small. No, God is bigger and his story is longer. So Isaiah reasons Abraham was only one man before God made him into a nation. Always remember to keep your story longer than your fear would tell you to have it. To switch to the typological, we have an example of the disciples telling short stories and getting really anxious about it in the gospel reading for today. Jesus was telling the long story of the gospel. He was taking them aside. He had just chosen the 12, and it says that he was telling them how he was appointed to suffer. This goes back to 2 chapters after our passage in Isaiah, Isaiah 53, the suffering servant. Long before it was foretold that Jesus would suffer, that he would fall into the hands of the authorities. He would be whipped and mocked and spitted upon, as it says. They couldn't handle it because the story that they were living in was too short. The story that they were living in began when the Romans took over. That was the only story they could see. And so the Messiah fit into this super short story. Oh, what does the Messiah mean? He is going to kick the Romans' butt. That's what the Messiah meant. It couldn't possibly mean that he was the suffering servant. That story's forgotten. We don't start our story that early. It couldn't possibly mean that he was the one prophesied in Genesis 3 that would be born of a woman who would crush the serpent's head. You see, they couldn't see, but would have his heel bruised. You see, if they would have told a longer story, they wouldn't have been so confused when Jesus told the story. It wouldn't have conflicted and caused so much anxiety, such that Peter took Jesus aside and he said, Jesus, you don't know what's really going on here. You're supposed to conquer. You're not supposed to be conquered. You're supposed to live within my short story that I'm constantly anxious about. You don't have permission from me, Jesus, to tell your long, peaceful story. So Jesus rebukes Peter. He calls him Satan. Get behind me, Satan, for you think of the things of men and not the things of God. Who do you think tells longer stories, men or God? Okay, I was just making sure you guys are paying attention. All right, we're going to switch to the moral reading, and for this I'm going to get a little bit more specific. So we have a tendency as people to tell very short stories. And we do this for 2 reasons. One is internal and one is external. We have a tendency to do this internally because when we tell a short story, who's the main character? We are. And we like that in some ways. But it makes us anxious because it's all up to us. So we have this enormous internal motivation to tell stories and to live within a narrative of our life that is entirely up to us. And that's a short story. But there's actually also external reasons why we tell short stories as human beings. And that is because, especially today, and I'll touch on this more later, there are literally billions of dollars spent every year to hook you and drag you in to someone else's FM frenetic story so that they could profit off of your fear. Billions of dollars are spent to rob you of living within God's long, arcing story. Let me point out some common short stories that people live within. The most common is the story of the present moment or the present crisis. This one's universal, people. Every one of us is reactive to the present moment. We struggle with this. Something happens, and it's as if we consider the entire story of our lives in that moment to be defined by the beginning of that crisis. And we forget the longer stories that would make the situation relax and actually give us foresight and wisdom. The crisis of the present moment is the shortest story we can tell. A little bit longer, but not reaching back far enough, is the story of our life. You might remember last year we read a book by Carl Trueman, and he walked through all of the philosophers that have been building to this moment in history. And he said that the culmination of their work is the movement of expressive individualism. Expressive individualism. This idea that the most important narrative to define our lives by is the story of our personal life and our unique impact upon the world around us. Is that the primary story of your life? It is not. Is it important how you spend your life? It is. Is that the story that defines you? No. You are a part of a much longer story, and you don't need to be anxious about how God's going to use you. You don't need to be anxious about how you're going to become known in the world through your own individual expression. God has got this taken care of. He tells long stories that began before you were born and will continue after you die. Another shorter story that hooks millions is a story of modern politics. Now, I'm going to warn you guys, we're heading into an election year. And when I said earlier that there are billions of dollars to hook you and drag you into a narrative that profits off your fear, there is none that compare to presidential elections. They would like to steal your every thought. But does God's story span before 2024? Does it span before 1990? Whatever moment we've started thinking about the rise of liberalism or the rise of conservatism, and when it became such a hot button issue, does God's story precede that? You might think, I'll start my story with the birth of this nation. Many people live a uniquely American story, and there are virtues to that. I think we have, compared to other nations, a fairly virtuous story. I love being an American. But the American dream or the American story is not synonymous with God's story. Does God's story precede America? Does God's story precede America? Yes. It does. You might think, I'll reach back further. And I'm going to start my story at the Protestant Reformation. That's whenever the story really got going. Does God's story begin before Cranmer? Luther? Should we reach back further? We should reach back further. You might think that I'm going to stop at the early church fathers. I don't know where you'd get that idea. I'm not. It would be a mistake to stop at the early church fathers. Many in the church stop there, and they think that they've drawn a story that's long enough. It ain't long enough. Always press further. You want to see how far we should go back? Where does our psalm take us? Where does Greg's meditation in the front of this booklet take us? There was darkness at the foundation of the world, and God spoke light into it. He filled the darkness with light. We live in that story. That's where the radio waves originate. Doesn't that bring you rest and calm to know that we're in a story that extends past the beginning of time? How will CTK retain her peace amidst so many troubling short narratives? When the world around us continues to disintegrate and become more and more frustrating, how will we not be sucked in to an FM frequency? We must keep our gentle arches, which are from eternity. It is unaffected by frenzy, and this is how the church ought to be. Not because we don't care about current events, but we're not defined by their short, frenetic narratives. We look to the rock from which we were hewn and the quarry from which we were dug. Jesus was the lamb slain before the foundations of the world. He is not some pawn on our chessboard. He doesn't fit into our story. We fit into his story. We don't protect him. He protects us. And the same goes for the church. The church is as old as time. Even before Adam and Eve, the church was. It existed in perfection then. The angels worshiped around the God of the whole universe. The church triumphant. For the whole story of human history, there has been the church. The church is not some little girl that needs to be protected. You are not her daddy. I am not her daddy. She is our mother. We are her children. She is this majestic bride of Christ. She is older than time itself. She just continues to grow in beauty. So when you see her assailed and wounded, don't make the mistake of shortening her story. She's older than you can imagine. She doesn't need you to stress over her. We are not to be driven by fear and frenzy. This is to be a non-anxious place amidst an anxious world. God is in control. He is telling a long, arching story. To switch finally to the anagogical, a subject like this tends towards the anagogical, because when Christ returns, then history as we know it will come to a conclusion. It will, as a symphony, come to a resolution. And in that moment, we will understand the long, symphonic movement of God's story. We will be on the other side of the final note, and we will see that all the notes that we thought were dissonant were actually just part of the whole. We just couldn't catch the melody yet. Beloved, let us be reminded daily to live in the long story. Do not be defined by the crisis of the present moment. Do not be defined by the frenzy of the next year. Let us be marked by peace, not by anxiety, not by fear. Amen.